When you play a paradox game, how much does historical plausibility matter? Pick a number between 1 and 10, where 1 is not at all, and 10 is above everything else. Put your numbers down in the comments, or just upvote someone else's number if it's the same as yours. With that pull out of the way, I'm not going to explain why the number that you picked is wrong, and you should have picked the real answer. Who let this guy cook? Really? A score from 1 to 10? See, the problem is that guy phrased the question all wrong. How much does historical plausibility matter? Like, okay nerd, go write your thesis. The real question is, yes or no, did you stop beating your wife yet? Yes or no, does immersion matter in a grand strategy game? Reply to the other comment you left that was just a number, and clarify your position with a yes or no, and if you had liked someone else's comment, then reply to their comment instead. Do not provide additional context. With that out of the way, I will now explain to you why the only correct answer is to uninstall Victoria 3. You know what feels great? When something works, not just how you expect it to, but how it feels like it should. You ever shoot someone in Metro and really feel like you've just caused a once vibrant Slavic soul to enter Slavic heaven? In this case, I shot a guy and I expected him to die, and he did. It's pretty easy to understand for these sorts of kinetic games, but the same idea absolutely applies to the thrill of map staring. Every action has an expectation, which is informed by something. In the case of a map game, it's history, in both senses of the word, which informs expectations. What little knowledge I have of history that isn't just from reading the unending walls of text in paradox games used to inform my expectations of games about history. When you're a Giga Chad like me though, you've got a collective 8,500 hours of map staring under your belt. That right there is history. At least in terms of my hopes of ever getting a girlfriend. History indeed. Point is, when you first start a game, your expectations are rooted in some kind of reference to your own experiences, and then, as you play the game more, your expectations instead become rooted in the game itself. This is where history becomes, well, frustrating, at least as far as historical games are concerned. You know, I don't remember reading about Gandhi's interest in nuclear bombs, yet civilization would have me thinking the man was obsessed. Apparently there is at least one Gandhi that was interested in atomic bombs though, so maybe art imitates life, eh? The thing is that Civilization is a game which is only vaguely inspired by history really. It's the backdrop, whereas for something like Victoria 3, history is the setting of the game. Historical expectations translate into things like borders, countries, army sizes, and modifiers. In the case of Victoria 3, not so much modifiers, but journal entries. To give you an idea of how this can matter to some people, there was a Victoria 3 patch where Prussia was allowed to connect itself directly by land to its states in Westphalia and the Rhineland. This was done for game balance reasons, as Prussia previously could never defend the region. Historically, Prussia was cut off from the west, but had enough influence over the German Federation's members to easily move soldiers across east and west. This ruffled some feathers. Most people didn't care much, but it brought up the idea of military access. In real life, when Prussia invaded Denmark, it wasn't via naval invasion, unlike in Victoria 3. No, Prussia just marched its men to Schleswig-Holstein through the other members of the German Federation. This lack of historicity is frustrating, and in this case I put the blame on Victoria 3. A military access system shouldn't be missing from a game like this, when it does have the violate sovereignty button, which no one will ever use by the way. Military access is a piece of history that isn't frustrating because translating it into a video game isn't very hard. If a country allows it, another country can move its army through territory it would normally not be allowed in. Simple. How about something like the role of a prime minister? In Prussian history, Otto von Bismarck is an extremely important figure for the fact that he essentially ran the country on its path towards a unified Germany. I'm glossing over his immense importance to instead focus on the fact that Bismarck in Victoria 3 is a royalist ideology interest group leader for the landowners who accomplishes exactly nothing in the game. His ideology is pointless because Prussia is already a monarchy, and interest group leaders do nothing besides slightly adjust numbers in relation to their interest group. Another number you should adjust is my subscriber count, by the way. Subscribe so I can beat Lemon Cake to 25k subs, because I'm the ultimate Giga Chad, and he's just a frustrated micro Chad. The frustration with history here is that the roles which different members of government play in guiding a nation are vast and hard to define in a game which is mostly centered around numbers. I mean, does Bismarck as some theoretical chancellor role in Victoria 3 just give some numbers? Does he trigger a journal entry? Does he act autonomously, akin to private investment? It's hard to say how exactly history can be translated into mechanics, and you have lots of options, but I can tell you right now that the current implementation of specifically Otto von Bismarck in Victoria 3 is entirely lackluster. The pattern continues for many of the historical figures of the game, and that issue continues for so many mechanics in the game. Every mechanic is based on some kind of historical precedent, and then it's translated into a game mechanic. For example, the cost of logistics in a market is a historical precedent represented in-game with market access price impact. What's stupid about it is that the cost of logistics between Delaware and New Jersey is the same as between New York and California. This is a world before the Pacific Railway, before the Panama Canal, and before the mass adoption of the car, at least in terms of when America will begin conquering the West. But even with that, it remains the case that even today, the cost of moving goods from Delaware to New Jersey is cheaper than from New Jersey to California. So it might seem like I'm just ragging on Victoria 3 here for its lack of quality representation of historical precedents. And to be very clear, that's correct, but it's not because I'm some history nerd who gets upset about Prussia being connected to its western states. It was actually a very wise choice to connect East and West in Prussia given the current state of the game, simply because it makes for a better game with regards to expectations. It is expected that Prussia can have an army in the Rhineland, so even if the way that's accomplished isn't perfectly historically accurate, it's better than the frustrating alternative of a Prussia that can't protect its western half. Translating history into a fun game mechanic will always require a sacrifice to make something fun. For example, real life can be really complicated in such a way that to translate it into a game could be way too much micromanagement. Imagine if instead of one good for fish, we split it up into cod, salmon, bass, sturgeon, and haddock. I don't really think there'd be much purpose to this, although it could add some depth to the good substitution mechanic in the game. I don't want to get caught up in the weeds. The point is that real life is extremely complex, and games probably shouldn't be that level of complex, unless the game were a dedicated fish trading game. Maybe Victory should become one. The question becomes one of how much sacrifice we're willing to make in order to create a good mechanic without betraying the historical precedents. That will of course depend on the ever-nebulous concept of game feel. I only care about history insofar as it corresponds to fun and interesting mechanics. Mechanics are more fun when they feel right. We might call this game feel, which for a game like Metro is about the kinematics of the weapons, but for Victoria 3 is about how choices and strategies affect outcomes. You know what strategy game has a great game feel? XCOM 2. And that's because when you flank an enemy with a shotgun from 3 tiles away, your excellent strategic choice is rewarded. And equally so, your now out of position shotgun guy has just been absolutely murdered by a muton, which might make you angry, but you know, it was your fault. So you're more angry at yourself, really. In case you conflate cool looking actions with game feel, I'll even bring up Crusader Kings 3, where murdering someone and seeing their heir be some kid you got matrilineally married to your daughter feels amazing. That too is game feel. The strategic marriage I made and the well-timed murder scheme resulted in my dynasty spreading to a new throne. Now here's the funny thing about Victoria 3. It does have some game feel, but never intentionally. It feels pretty good to drop the perfect naval invasion or to stack up buildings and decrees in the perfect state with all the right modifiers to make some insane profits. It feels good to find just the right agitator and then abdicate to some revolution to pass a law you'd have otherwise had trouble with. Barring the perfect state building stacking, I don't think any of this is intentional. I feel good about the perfect naval invasion because it lets me avoid the broken front system. I like the agitators and abdications because they let me avoid the completely random legal system of Victoria 3. These feel good because it feels like I did something smart and I got rewarded in the game for it, hence a positive game feel. Victoria 3 by its very nature has lacking game feel since so much of what might feel correct in the game won't necessarily correspond to an immediate recognition of that. Cut to the Metro Exodus headshot, then cut to the high-scale Victoria 3 gameplay. Nonetheless, when you build a strong economy in Victoria 3, you are succeeding, you just might not realize it until you compare GDP graphs with another country. That's alright, the game's not for everyone. It's the kind of game that appeals to nerds and long-term gamers who like to reflect on the entire campaign, rather than people looking to celebrate the success after one war. One sort of unique sense of game feel that all the Paradox games have in my opinion is the historical aspect though. Since everything is so steeped in history, there's a high degree of satisfaction to creating sensible history for a lot of players. Taking Byzantium from its starting position to 1000 development is somehow different from taking any other country of a similar position to 1000 development, and that's because the legacy that Byzantium has in its history. If the nation didn't have that legacy, it wouldn't be so exciting. And if you want to feel that experience yourself, go play the Anbanar mod for Europa Universalis 4 and play any Dwarven nation and then restore the Dwarven Empire. If you're not familiar with the history of Anbanar's fantasy world, then you probably won't feel as much satisfaction in doing this since you don't have a concept of the grandeur of the Dwarven Empire within that mod's history. But if you've done a lot of reading of the flavor text in that mod's mission trees and events, you start to get an understanding of exactly how much of an undertaking it is, and of the prestige of the nation you're forming. Play any alternate history mod which diverges enough that you don't have a strong sense of the historical importance of anything, and you'll experience this in similar measure. But the effect is most powerful in fantasy-based total conversions where you have no historical reference. This is why no matter what anyone thinks of Victoria 3, it's still somehow actually fun to form Byzantium in the game, as opposed to forming something like Romania, despite the processes being pretty similar. Not to disrespect Romania, who of course also shares in the glory of Rome based on its name and language, but Byzantium's just got that dog in it. In Europa Universalis 4, the dopamine machine is strong, with each historically accurate or at least historically plausible outcome often having a mission associated with it that rewards those accomplishments. Now, I think mission trees are cool in moderation, although the topic of another video could be the absolute dominance of mission trees for everything in Europa Universalis, but I want to point to the purpose of mission trees, not the implementation of them. A mission tree provides context and rewards for your accomplishments. The closest equivalent to a mission tree in Victoria 3 is a journal entry. Consider the Brazilian journal entries with Colossus of the South. What makes them less satisfying than a mission tree? It's that what you're achieving isn't a particularly amazing reward, and it doesn't lead into more strategic options. For example, when you're assimilating all of the different Brazilian cultures, it's not like those cultures were previously discriminated, or that you could otherwise care to achieve this if it were possible without the journal entry. You achieve it because the game has told you, via a journal entry, that it is important to do so, and then the reward is about as inconsequential. You also do it because fewer pop types means less lag, but that's beside the point. In EU4, everything, including the set of missions you must accomplish, the rewards for the missions, and the impact of the missions on the game world is much better. Like I said before, it's a whole rabbit hole to talk about EU4 mission trees, but overall, I do rate them higher than Victoria 3 journal entries. Remember when I talked about sacrifice? This is where it comes in, and it comes in the form of a gradient of historical accuracy against playability. You know, the ultimate way to experience alternate history is to just learn real history and then daydream a bit. Ultimately, no Paradox game will ever produce as creative a world as the one you can imagine in your head, but what these games do is act as a catalyst for your creativity. While your extremely complex, creative brain may only have to make some sacrifices in historicity to make your wildest dreams come to be, this video game is not so capable. When making a game, the enjoyment of the game should always come first, that or the profit margins, and in the pursuit of that enjoyment there will always be sacrifices. History has been on the chopping block for a while, but what should be sacrificed and what should be kept? The easy answer is that everything fun should be kept, but of course not everyone agrees on what is fun. Looking at Victoria 3, we can identify a central set of historical themes, which to me are industrialization, great power politics, and ideology. Everyone knows that Victoria 3 is all about industrialization and the rapid advances in technology and production that took place in the 19th and 20th centuries, so we should draw from history relating to that. Victoria 3 is nominally a game about diplomacy, but I actually think that it's not. There isn't a whole lot of diplomacy in Victoria 3, as it is instead replaced with great power politics. When power blocks were announced, some people had the idea that they could make a coalition of smaller powers to resist great powers. But such a thing was completely impossible when it later became known that only great powers and major powers could form blocks. Victoria 3's diplomacy thrives in the context of competing great powers, so we should draw from that too. Think of the Berlin Conference and the Concert of Europe, among other great power-oriented political occurrences. Lastly, there's ideology, and this is of course referring to events like the Springtime of Nations and the rise of communism and later fascism. Beyond even that, just the rise of republicanism or the transition from absolutist monarchies to constitutional ones. We definitely want that history too. And then from there, we have to cut it off to avoid making this game into a gargantuan behemoth. So what gets sacrificed? While the Victorian period features figures like Helmuth von Moltke, who revolutionized warfare during the Franco-Prussian War, but to be honest with you, war in Victoria 3 kinda sucks, so I don't care to do much with it. Maybe one day it could be expanded upon, but I do genuinely consider war mechanics to be a secondary concern for Victoria 3. It's probably my most controversial take on the game, as most people complain about it, but I actually am pretty okay with a hands-off war system. I just want the goddamn fronts to not break constantly. Watch the Canada video to see how much this game sucks. It's my opinion that if Victoria 3 can make, let's say, 3 solid mechanics for those 3 themes, it'd be an amazingly solid game. That would be 9 mechanics, and assuming all 9 interact with each other, you've got a ton of nuance going there. Luckily, industry, politics, and ideology all go hand in hand, so it's not hard to see them working in lockstep. For industry in Victoria 3, the current mechanics are buildings, ownership, and companies. The problem is that these mechanics are not super interesting, at least individually. As a whole, they start to play a beautiful concert, but I think if those mechanics would be beefed up, you'd have a real symphony. For great power politics, you've got a cacophony of power blocks, diplomatic plays, and subject interactions, which, again, aren't amazing on their own. Power blocks are probably the best of that bunch as a standalone piece, and with how it interacts with the rest of the game, but diplomatic plays are extremely lame and limited. For ideology, we've got political movements, interest groups, and agitators, which if you've played the game, you know are all just 3 different ways to say randomness. With recent dev diaries, we've seen that Paradox wants to change this system, and I do encourage that, but I'm analyzing these mechanics as of their state in 1.7. You might feel that there's still mechanics missing from the game, even if this set of 9 were to be brought up to a legendary status, and you'd be correct. But this is the sacrifice we make in order to have a fun-to-play game. For example, I personally feel that international trade should be a more important part of Victoria 3, comparative advantage and all that jazz, but I can recognize that maybe it's not all that important in the grand scheme of things, or at the very least not a priority. I've even made some sacrifices for this video. Do you know how badly I want to yap about the specifics of what mechanics I want? I have entire videos, which are now outdated, dedicated to outlining and describing exact specifics behind mechanics that I want, but I've had to cut that because I don't want this video to be overly long. Sacrifice is hard in a world as nuanced as ours. It can feel like every minute detail is important to the construction of history as we know it, but sometimes stepping back and realizing that it's a game we're making is important. Victoria 3 made a pretty big misstep as a game despite making a powerful step towards historicity when it changed how transportation and electricity worked. I do like local prices, but not local goods. It's true that it is nonsensical for power plants in New York to power the entire American market, but my god, it sucks to build up an individual electricity sector for every single state. The same goes for transportation, as although it makes no sense for rails in New York to provide transportation for California, it's just not as fun to have to manage that good. Now, I will say that this break of historicity is more egregious than others, but I will genuinely put forward the question to you. If you've played Victoria 3, is the game better with local electricity? Hey, if you think it really is better, that's fine. And in fact, I'd invite you to comment below why you think that, so as to spark a conversation where we can all learn a bit about other perspectives. But I'm telling you, you're just wrong, idiot. There's no greater drama than the stories of our past told by people who've never witnessed it. I have a friend in real life, shocker I know, that loves history, and he's a very emotive guy. He's actually a professional actor out here in Vancouver. Maybe he's watching. Hey, my dude. This friend of mine knows a lot of miscellaneous stories from history, and he'll sometimes recount for me and other mutual friends of ours those tales of immense brutality and tragedy with the widest smile on his face. Despite the mismatch in the actual content of the story and the emotions behind it, he's good enough at telling those stories that he can make you feel like maybe you were there. History is, when written about in academia, a collection of information and arguments that are, in all likelihood, accurate and wise, and incisive with regards to the material they're covering, yet somehow I think it's dehumanizing to forget about the central figure of history: humanity. Time heals all wounds, someone wiser than me once said, and I think that applies most strongly to history, where Genghis Khan's anti-carbon emission policies somehow evoke less anger in people than the Canadian carbon tax. History creates distance, and the best history games shorten the gap in much the same way my actor friend does. Victoria 3 makes me feel pretty distant from the history it's recounting to me, and that could be for many reasons, but maybe it's because Victoria 3 doesn't smile enough when it's telling its stories. Maybe it smiles too much. What I do know is that history is somehow both the most important and least important thing in a Paradox game. You need history for the foundation, but you can't make the whole monument out of it. Victoria 3 makes me feel frustrated with the sacrifices that its history has to make, and that's why I recommend that you uninstall it. We started this video asking about immersion, and I hate that word, because it doesn't mean much to me. I've never lost myself in a game of Victoria 3, yet I've lost myself in my thoughts about the game. I don't know where it'll go in the future. But I do know that right now, it somehow manages to be a slave to history without paying it the appropriate respect to feel historical. And until that changes, the game will rot in mediocrity. Thank you for your time.